There is a kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix. A tiredness that comes not from the body, but from the searching, from the quiet, endless, reaching inside yourself for something you cannot name, something you feel must be just beyond where you are right now. Maybe you have felt it tonight. That restless pull, the sense that peace is somewhere else. That if you could only find the right thought, the right understanding, the right moment, you would finally arrive. You have been running a long time, perhaps without even knowing it. Running from one day to the next, from one hope to the next, always leaning forward into a future that keeps moving just ahead of you. And tonight, that running has followed you into this quiet room, into this dark hour, into the space between waking and rest. This video offers contemplative stories drawn from Buddhist wisdom traditions across Asia, created for rest and reflection, not as medical or therapeutic guidance. What you will hear tonight are the journeys of people who once ran just as you are running. People who searched with everything they had, and who, one by one, discovered something extraordinary, not at the end of the search, but in the moment they stopped. Over the next 3 hours, we will travel through ancient temples and mountain hermitages, through rain-soaked forests and still waters, through the quiet lives of monks and merchants, kings and wanderers. Each story is a world unto itself. You do not need to understand any of it. You do not need to remember. If sleep finds you before the story's end, that is exactly as it should be. So let your shoulders soften now. Let your hands release whatever they have been holding. Feel the weight of the blanket, the cool air against your skin, the slow rhythm of your own breath. You have arrived somewhere safe. There is nowhere else to go tonight. The searching can rest. And so, gently, can you, in the autumn of 1231, in a valley where mist gathered each morning like breath between the cedar trees, there stood a small Zen monastery called Jurinji. It was not a famous place. No lord had built it. No emperor had blessed it with golden robes or land grants. It had grown, over the decades, the way moss grows on stone quietly, without permission, without anyone noticing until it was simply there. The main hall was modest, its wooden beams darkened by years of incense, smoke, its clay tiles uneven and patched where autumn storms had loosened them. Behind the hall, a kitchen building sat beside a narrow stream, and it was here, in the grey hours before dawn, that a young monk named Ryon had spent the last 4 years of his life washing rice. Ryon had come to Jurinji at 19, having walked for 11 days from the merchant town of Ekizen. He had left behind a household where his father traded in lacquerware, where the shelves were lined with polished boxes destined for wealthy buyers, and where every conversation turned, eventually, to profit. His mother had wept quietly when he announced his intention to leave. She had pressed a small pouch of dried plum into his hands at the door, and he had carried it with him until the last plum crumbled to dust somewhere along the mountain path. He arrived at the monastery thin, earnest, and burning with a single question that had followed him since he was 15 years old. Since the afternoon he sat alone on a hillside, watching clouds dissolve into blue sky, and felt, for one brief and inexplicable moment, that everything was already complete. The feeling vanished almost as soon as he recognized it, but it left behind a hunger, a desperate, aching need to return to that place, to find it again, to hold it in his hands and never let it go. He had come to Jurinji to find that place, to find enlightenment, to stop being the restless, incomplete person he felt himself to be and become. Finally, whole, For the first 2 years, Ryoen threw himself into practice with a ferocity that alarmed even the senior monks. He sat in zazen until his knees ached and his back burned. He studied the sutras by candlelight until his eyes watered. He performed every chore assigned to him with an intensity that bordered on desperation, scrubbing the stone courtyard, carrying firewood, weeding the garden in the cold rain, always searching, in each task, for the crack through which enlightenment might seep in. He watched the older monks, studied their faces for signs of attainment, and felt a growing bewilderment when they seemed to possess no special radiance, no visible transformation. They simply lived. They cooked. They sat. They swept. They ate their plain rice and pickled vegetables in silence, and there was nothing about them that suggested they had found anything remarkable at all. It was in his 3rd year that the temple's cook, an aging monk named Sonan, fell ill with a persistent cough that rattled through his chest like stones in a dry creek bed. Sonan could no longer lift the heavy rice pot or kneel for the hours required to tend the fire. And so the duty of Tenzo, the temple cook, was given to Ryoen. He accepted it with poorly concealed disappointment. Cooking rice was not what he had come to a monastery to do. It was not meditation. It was not study. It was not the path to the great awakening he had been chasing since that hillside afternoon 6 years before. But the abbot, a quiet man named Genjo, who spoke rarely and smiled often, simply bowed and said, "The rice does not know it is being cooked. See if you can learn something from that." The first weeks in the kitchen were an agony of small frustrations. The fire would not draw properly in the damp morning air, and the rice would come out mushy and grey, or it would cook too quickly, catching at the bottom of the iron pot, filling the kitchen with a sharp, acrid smell that lingered in the wooden walls for days. Ryoen scrubbed the pot until his fingers were raw. He studied the way the water moved when it was heated, the way steam curled and disappeared, the precise shade of amber the fire needed to reach before the rice would cook evenly. He poured water and measured grain and adjusted flame with the same desperate concentration he brought to everything, always searching within the task for something beyond it, some hidden teaching that would unlock the door he had been pressing against for years. One morning in early winter, when frost had sealed the surface of the stream and the air in the kitchen was so cold that his breath hung before his face like small ghosts, Ryoen was washing the rice for the midday meal. His hands were submerged in the wooden bucket, turning the grains gently, watching the cloudy water cloud further with starch before he poured it out and drew fresh water from the well. It was a task he had performed hundreds of times by now. The water was numbing. His fingers had grown rough and cracked from the cold and the constant immersion. And yet, on this particular morning, something shifted. He was not thinking about enlightenment. He was not searching for anything. He was simply feeling the weight of the rice in his palm, the cool slip of water between his fingers, the faint, gritty texture of each grain against his skin. The steam from the nearby cooking pot drifted across his face, warm and faintly sweet. Somewhere outside, a single crow called, and the sound fell into the silence of the kitchen, the way a stone falls into still water, creating a ripple and then being absorbed completely. And in that moment, with his hands in the water and the cold air against his cheeks and the sound of the crow fading into nothing, Ryoen felt it again. That same completeness he had felt on the hillside at 15. Not a grand revelation, not a blinding light, simply a quiet recognition, as though he had been looking everywhere in a dark room for a candle, and had suddenly realized that his own hands were glowing. He stood very still for a long time after that, his hands still in the water, which had grown warm from the heat of his skin. The rice moved gently with each slight tremor of his breathing, and something in his chest, something that had been clenched and straining for years, began, very slowly, to release. That evening, after the monks had eaten their meal in silence, miso, broth, rice, and a small dish of pickled radish, Ryoan found the abbot sitting alone in the garden, watching the last light fade from the sky. The bare branches of the plum trees were black against the deep blue above, and a single star had appeared, faint and unsteady, near the horizon. "Master," Ryoan said, and then stopped. He did not know how to put into words what had happened in the kitchen that morning. It had not been a thought. It had not been an experience he could describe with the language he had spent years studying. It was more like the absence of something, the absence of the searching itself. Genjo looked at him with calm, unhurried eyes. "You found it in the rice," he said. It was not a question. Ryoan nodded slowly. The abbot was quiet for a moment, watching the star brighten as the sky deepened. Then he said, "When you first came here, you were looking for enlightenment, the way a man looks for water in a desert desperately, always in the distance, always believing it must be somewhere you have not yet gone. But the water was never in the distance. It was in your body the whole time. You were thirsty because you had forgotten to notice you were already drinking." He paused, and a thin branch of the plum tree creaked softly in a breeze that carried the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen. "The rice did not teach you anything new," Genjo continued. "It simply stopped you from running. And when you stopped running, you found yourself exactly where you had always been." Ryoan stood with the abbot in the garden until the stars filled the sky, and the cold air settled around them like a blanket, and neither of them spoke again. There was nothing left to say. The searching had ended, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with the gentlest of arrivals, the way dawn arrives, not all at once, but grain by grain of light, until the darkness is simply no longer there. In the years that followed, Ryoan continued to cook. He rose before dawn each morning and walked to the kitchen in the dark, his breath visible in the cold air, his wooden sandals quiet on the stone path. He washed the rice. He tended the fire. He ladled the miso into clay bowls with the same care and attention he brought to each breath in zazen. And the monks who ate his meals noticed, without being able to say exactly why, that the food tasted different, not richer or more flavorful, but somehow more nourishing, as though each grain carried not just sustenance for the body, but a quietness for the mind. He never spoke of what had happened that winter morning. There was no need. The teaching lived not in words, but in the way he moved through each day, unhurried, present, complete, not searching, not arriving, simply here. And here, as you listen to these words, is enough. You do not need to find what you are looking for. It is already present in the weight of the blanket across your body, in the rhythm of your breath, in the quiet dark of this moment. The searching can rest now. Let your hands release. Let your shoulders drop. The rice is already cooked. The water is already here. And as that quiet completeness settles around you like wood smoke on a still morning, we travel now to another life, another tradition, where a woman carried the same restless searching across an entire country before she discovered that the journey itself had been the destination all along. Let your breath slow. Feel the coolness of the air against your skin. There is no rush. The next story is already waiting, like a door left gently open. Simply let yourself drift toward it. In the spirit of Vietnamese Zen, drawing from the teachings of the Truk Lam tradition. We find this story of a woman who walked the length of a country before she understood that every step had already brought her home. In the year 1288, in the northern reaches of Dai Viet, where the Red River split into fingers of brown water that spread across a vast and fertile delta, there lived a woman named Lin. She was 32 years old, the wife of a rice merchant who traveled often to the coastal markets, and the mother of a boy named Bao, who was 7, and a girl named Cho, who was 4. Their home was a wooden house on stilts at the edge of a village called Hung Len, where the land was so flat and green that on clear mornings you could see nothing but rice paddies stretching in every direction, their surfaces catching the early light like sheets of hammered copper, broken only by the dark silhouettes of water buffalo standing knee-deep in irrigation channels, and by the thin, crooked lines of dikes that separated one family's field from another. Ling was not, by nature, a restless person. She had grown up in the village, married, young, built a quiet life around the rhythms of the rice harvest and the slow turning of the seasons. She cooked. She mended clothes. She carried water from the well each morning in 2 clay vessels balanced on a bamboo pole across her shoulders, the poles creaking gently with each step, the water sloshing softly against the insides of the jars. In the evenings, she sat with her children by the lamp, telling them stories her own mother had told, her tales of dragons and jade mountains and clever foxes who outwitted kings. But there was something inside her, a thread of longing she could never quite name, that pulled at her during quiet moments. It came most strongly in the early hours, before the children woke, when she sat alone on the wooden platform outside her door and watched the mist rise from the paddies in long, pale ribbons. In those moments, she felt as though she was standing at the edge of something vast, not frightening, but enormous, and that if she could only be still enough, or walk far enough, or understand the right teaching, she might step into it and finally feel whole. She had heard from traveling monks who passed through the village on their way between monasteries that there were teachers in the south, wise men and women who could point the way to peace. The monks spoke of a teaching called Tien, a way of sitting and watching the mind until it grew quiet as still water. They spoke of Buddha nature, present in all things, waiting only to be recognized. And Ling, listening to these words in the flickering lamplight, felt the thread of longing tighten in her chest. The peace they described, she wanted it desperately. She wanted it the way a thirsty person wants water, the way a person lost in darkness wants to find a single point of light. It was in the spring of that year, after the monsoon rains had begun to ease, that Lin made her decision. Her husband was away on one of his trading journeys, and her mother-in-law, a sturdy, uncomplaining woman named Ku Huang, agreed to care for the children. Lin packed a small bundle, a change of clothes, a handful of dried fish wrapped in banana leaves, a clay cup for drinking, and set out southward along the river road. She walked for 40 days. The journey took her through landscapes that shifted and changed, like the moods of a dreaming mind. She followed the Red River south through stretches of dense lowland forest, where the air was so thick with moisture that her clothes never fully dried, and the sounds of insects rose at dusk into a roaring chorus that filled every corner of the sky. She crossed wide, slow tributaries on flat-bottomed ferryboats poled by old men who said nothing, their faces creased and dark from years of sun and water. She passed through villages where dogs barked at her shadow and children stared from doorways with wide, curious eyes. She slept in the open on nights when no inn was near, curling beneath the roots of banyan trees, whose aerial roots hung down like the fingers of enormous hands. And she listened to the river moving in the darkness nearby, a sound like breathing, Along the way, she stopped at every temple she found. She sat in meditation halls where incense smoke curled in slow spirals toward painted ceilings. She listened to monks recite sutras in voices so measured and unhurried that the words themselves seemed to dissolve into sound before their meaning could take hold. She asked questions earnest, searching questions about how to find peace, how to quiet the restless turning of the mind, how to arrive at the stillness the monks described so beautifully in their teachings. The monks answered her patiently. They gave her instructions. Watch the breath. Count the exhalations. Notice when the mind wanders and gently return. They spoke of letting go, of non-attachment, of the mind's original clarity beneath the clouds of thought. Lynn practiced everything they taught her. She sat for hours, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, watching her breath rise and fall. And for moments brief, flickering moments, she felt something. A loosening, a softening, like the first warmth of sun after a long night. But it never stayed. Each time she noticed it, the noticing itself seemed to chase it away, like a bird startled from a branch. And then the searching would begin again, more urgent than before, and she would pack her bundle and walk further south, certain that the next temple, the next teacher, the next teaching would finally bring her to the place she had been trying to reach. By the time she had walked for 30 days, her feet were blistered and wrapped in strips of cloth torn from her spare clothes. The dried fish had long since been eaten. She begged meals at villages along the way, bowls of rice with pickled greens, thin soups made from river fish, and grateful monks gave her bread and fruit at the temples where she stopped. But the hunger that drove her was not a hunger for food. It was something deeper, something that no teaching seemed to satisfy, no matter how wise or beautiful. It was on the 38th day of her journey, in a small village near a bend in a tributary river, that she encountered an old woman sitting alone beneath a mango tree. The woman was perhaps 60 or 70. It was difficult to tell. Her hair was completely white, pulled back and tied with a strip of faded cloth. Her hands, resting in her lap, were gnarled and spotted with age, but her eyes were remarkably clear, dark and calm, like two still pools reflecting sky. Lynn had stopped to rest beneath the same tree, and for a while the two women sat in silence, watching the river move past the edge of the village. A small fishing boat drifted by, its sail hanging limp in the windless air. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, and the sound carried across the water and faded. "You are searching for something," the old woman said at last. It was not a question. Lynn nodded. "Peace," she said. "The teachers speak of a stillness within. I have been walking for many days, listening to their teachings, practicing what they tell me, but I cannot find it. It comes and goes like smoke." The old woman smiled. It was a gentle smile, without pity, without judgment, the smile of someone who recognized something familiar. "Tell me," she said, "when you cook your rice at home, do you think about the rice while you cook it?" Lynn looked at her, puzzled. "Yes. I watch the water. I listen to know when it is boiling. I stir so it does not burn. And when you carry water from the well, are you aware of the weight of the jars on your pole?" "Yes. I feel it in my shoulders, in my legs." "And when your children laugh, do you hear their laughter?" "Of course." The old woman nodded slowly, as though Lynn had confirmed something she had long suspected. Then she said, "All of those moments, the rice, the water, the laughter of your children, that is the stillness the teachers are speaking of. It was never somewhere else. It was never something you had to find by walking 40 days. It was in your hands every morning when you lifted the water jars. It was in your ears every evening when your daughter laughed. It was in the smell of the rice cooking, in the feel of the rain on your skin, in every breath you have ever taken. She paused, and a breeze moved through the mango leaves above them, stirring them with a sound like soft applause. "You have been running toward a place," she said, "but the place you are running toward is exactly where you have always been standing. The treasure is not at the end of the road. It is inside the house. It has always been inside the house." Lynn sat very still for a long time after that. The river moved past. The child somewhere nearby laughed again, and this time Lynn heard it differently, not as a distant sound, but as something close and vivid and present, as though the laughter were happening inside her own chest. She looked down at her hands, cracked and blistered from weeks of walking, dusty from the road, and something shifted. Not a grand revelation, not a flash of light, simply a quiet recognition, like waking from a dream and realizing you have been home all along, and that the dream of wandering was itself a kind of sleep. That evening, Lynn did not continue south. She turned and began the long walk back to Lynn. The journey home took her 22 days, and on each day, she noticed things she had walked past without seeing on her way south. The way the morning mist lifted from the rice paddies in long golden sheets, the sound of water buffalo breathing in the shallow channels, slow and heavy and alive. The particular green of new rice shoots after rain, a green so vivid it seemed almost to glow. The way a single crow's call could open up the silence of an entire sky and then leave it deeper than before. She arrived home on a warm evening, when the light was falling sideways across the paddies and turning everything the color of ripe persimmons. Her mother-in-law was in the kitchen, stirring something in a clay pot. Her son Bao was sitting on the platform outside, whittling a stick with a small knife. And her daughter, Xiao, ran to her across the yard, barefoot in the mud, arms outstretched, laughing, and Lynn knelt down and held her daughter against her chest and breathed in the smell of the child's hair and felt, in that single moment, everything she had walked 40 days to find. She never spoke of the old woman beneath the mango tree. There was no need. The teaching had not been something added to her life. It had simply been a gentle removal, a loosening of the knot of believing that peace was somewhere other than here. And once that knot was loosened, it stayed loose. Not perfectly, not always, but enough. Enough that, on quiet mornings, sitting on the platform with her cup of tea, watching the mist rise from the paddies, she no longer felt the pull to run. The searching had stopped, and in the stillness it left behind, she found that everything she had ever needed was already present in the weight of the water jars, in the smell of cooking rice, in the laughter of her children, in the simple, unhurried fact of being alive. And as that gentle recognition settles into you now, the understanding that what you seek is not distant but immediate, not hidden but already here. Let your body sink a little deeper into the warmth beneath you. Feel the weight of the blanket. Feel the rhythm of your own breathing, slow and steady as a river finding its way home. There is nowhere you need to walk. There is nothing you need to find. You are already here. You have always been here. And as that sense of quiet arrival softens through you like warmth spreading from the chest outward, we travel now to another tradition, another time, where a young monk in the mountains of Korea discovered that the question he had been asking his entire life was itself the doorway he had been looking for. Let your shoulders release. Let your jaw soften. Feel the darkness behind your closed eyes peaceful, spacious, like an open sky at night. The next journey is already here, waiting gently. Simply let yourself drift toward it. In the spirit of Korean Seon Buddhism, drawing from the tradition of Hwadu practice, we find this story of a young monk who spent years demanding answers from the mountains before he discovered that the question was never meant to be solved, only inhabited. On a mountain called Samji-yeon, in the central highlands of Korea, during the reign of the Goryeo dynasty, there stood a small hermitage known as Bangsamam. It was not a grand monastery. There was no golden Buddha, no painted hall, no bell tower to call monks to prayer across the valley. There was only a single wooden building, low and dark-roofed, tucked into a fold of the mountainside where ancient pines grew so thick and tall that their roots had broken through the stone in places, and where the air on still mornings carried the resin-sharp smell of their bark mixed with the cold, clean scent of snow that lingered even well into spring. A monk named Hyun lived there alone. He was 26 years old, though he had already spent 9 years in monasteries. He had entered the Sangha at 17, driven by a hunger for understanding that had set him apart from other young men in his village, a hunger so fierce and so persistent that even as a boy he had been known as the one who would not stop asking questions. His parents, rice farmers in a valley where the mountains turned red and gold each autumn, had watched him leave with a mixture of pride and quiet worry. He was brilliant. They knew, but brilliance, in their experience, was not always a protection against suffering. At the monastery where he first trained, Hyun had been an exceptional student. He memorized sutras with astonishing speed. He could debate Buddhist philosophy with monks twice his age, untangling arguments about the nature of mind and emptiness with a clarity that left his teachers both impressed and, sometimes, uneasy. There was a sharpness to his intellect that could cut through confusion like a blade through silk, but it could also cut through peace, through stillness, through every quiet moment that might otherwise have allowed something deeper to settle. He moved from monastery to monastery during his early years, always seeking the teacher who could finally give him the answer he craved. The answer to what, precisely, he could not have said. It was not a single question, but a vast and restless ache, a feeling that the truth was just beyond his reach, that if he could only think clearly enough, study long enough, understand one more teaching, he would finally grasp it and the ache would end. It was at a large monastery on the coast that he first encountered the practice of Hwadu. The head monk there, an old man named Sunim Dejak, whose face was so creased and weathered it looked like the bark of an ancient tree, sat with Hyun one evening after the others had gone to sleep. The fire in the small room had burned down to glowing coals. Outside, the sound of waves against the rocks filled the darkness like a slow, continuous breathing. "You have been studying for many years," Sunim Dejak said. "You know the sutras well. You can argue philosophy, but tell me, has your mind grown quiet?" Hyun was silent for a moment. He knew the honest answer. "No," he said. The old monk nodded, as though this were exactly what he expected. "Then studying has not yet served you. Not the way you need to be served." He paused, watching the coals pulse and dim. "There is a practice in our tradition. It is called Hwadu, a critical phrase. Not a question to be answered with words. A question to be lived inside of. The phrase, 'I will give you' is this. What is this?" Hyun looked at him, waiting for more. But the old monk simply smiled and said, "Ask it. Not with your thinking mind. Ask it with your whole being. When you walk, ask it. When you eat, ask it. When you sit in meditation, ask it. and do not try to answer it. Simply stay with the asking. Hyun bowed and left the room. That night, he sat in the dark and repeated the phrase silently, "What is this? What is this? What is this?" And immediately, his mind began to do what it had always done. It began to think, "What is this? This is a room. This is darkness. This is the sound of the ocean. This is my body sitting on a cushion. This is the practice of Hwadu as taught by Sunim Dejak, who learned it from his teacher, before him. And the technique involves holding the question as an object of concentration while allowing the analytical mind to gradually exhaust itself." He stopped. He noticed what was happening. His mind had turned the question into another thing to understand, another puzzle to solve. He returned to the phrase, "What is this?" And the mind, like a dog that has been called, came back and then immediately began to run again in circles. This went on for weeks. He unsat and asked and thought and caught himself thinking and returned to the question and thought again. It was maddening. It was the most frustrating thing he had ever done. He had mastered sutras. He had won debates. And here was a single, simple phrase that defeated him entirely. It was in this state of frustration that he came to Baing Sam Am. A wandering monk had told him of the hermitage high on Samjiyon, a place so remote and quiet that one could practice without interruption. Hyun climbed the mountain in early autumn, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air had the first sharp edge of coming cold. The path wound upward through forests of pine and oak, and as he climbed higher, the trees grew denser and the light grew dimmer, filtering through the canopy in long, pale shafts that moved with the wind. By the time he reached the hermitage, the village below had disappeared entirely. There was only the mountain, the trees, the sky, and a silence so complete that his own footsteps on the wooden floor of the hermitage seemed impossibly loud. He settled into the rhythm of solitary practice. Each morning he rose before dawn, when the sky was still dark and the stars were visible through gaps in the pine canopy, sharp and cold and impossibly numerous. He sat in meditation for hours, holding the Hwadu in his mind like a flame cupped between his hands, trying to keep it alive without letting the wind of thought blow it out. What is this? What is this? What is this? The first weeks were agony. His mind churned. It produced arguments, memories, plans, fears, philosophical frameworks, doubts about whether he was practicing correctly, doubts about whether the practice itself was worthwhile, doubts about whether he would ever understand anything at all. Each time he noticed the thinking, he returned to the question. Each time, the mind dragged him away again. He began to feel as though he were wrestling with something vast and formless, not an enemy. Exactly, but something so deeply entrenched in him that it seemed impossible to dislodge. The mountain, through all of this, remained utterly indifferent. The pines stood in their ancient stillness. The mist rose each morning from the valley below and curled through the trees like something alive, and then burned off in the late morning sun, leaving the air washed and clear. Deer moved through the undergrowth at dusk, their hooves barely audible on the fallen needles. A stream ran down the mountainside, not far from the hermitage, and its sound constant, unhurried, neither rising nor falling, filled the nights like a lullaby he had not asked for but could not escape. Slowly, over the weeks and then the months, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the way ice thaws in spring, imperceptibly at first. And then, one morning, you notice that the surface has changed. The thinking did not stop. but it began to quiet. Or rather, Hyun began to notice something he had not noticed before. The thoughts were not the whole of his experience. They were like clouds moving across a sky. They came and went, arose and dissolved. But beneath them, or behind them, or around them, he could not say which there was something else. Something that was always there, regardless of whether the thoughts were loud or quiet, whether the mind was agitated or calm. Something that watched the clouds without being any of them. He did not recognize this at first as anything significant. It was simply a quieting, a slight loosening of the grip that his thinking had always had on him. But as the months passed and the autumn deepened and the first snows began to fall on the upper slopes of Samjiyon, he found himself asking the Hwadu differently. Not with urgency, not with the desperate hunger for an answer, simply with a kind of open, wondering curiosity, the way a child might ask a question, not because they expect a reply, but because the asking itself feels good. What is this? What is this? And one morning, in the deep stillness before dawn, when the snow lay thick on the ground outside and the hermitage was wrapped in a silence so profound that Hyun could hear his own heartbeat, he asked the question one more time, "What is this?" And for the first time, he did not try to answer it. He simply stayed with it. The question hung in his mind like a note struck on a bell, vibrating and expanding outward, filling the space of his awareness the way the sound of the stream filled the night. And in that vibration, in that open space of not knowing, something dissolved. Not a thought, not an idea, something older and more fundamental, the very habit of grasping, the deep assumption that peace was something to be achieved, that understanding was somewhere ahead of him, that he needed to arrive at a destination he had not yet reached. He sat for a very long time in that stillness. The sky outside the hermitage window turned from black to deep blue to pale grey as dawn approached. Snow fell silently through the air, and Hyun sat, not searching, not striving, not even asking, simply present, simply here. The question having opened into something that was no longer a question at all, but a vast and quiet space in which everything, the snow, the silence, the mountain, his own breathing simply was. When the sun finally rose, its light fell across the hermitage floor in a long golden bar that moved slowly as the earth turned. Hyun watched it move. He watched the dust motes drift in the light, each one catching the sun for an instant before drifting on. And he felt not joy, exactly, and not peace, exactly, but something beneath both of those words, something that had always been there, underneath the searching, underneath the questions, underneath the years of striving, something that required no effort to find because it had never been lost. He remained at Bangsamam through that winter and into the following spring. He did not stop practicing. He continued to ask the Hwadu, "What is this?" But now the asking was gentle, almost playful, like a child picking up a stone by a stream and turning it over in their hand. Not to understand it, but simply to feel its weight and smoothness. And the mountain, which had been so patient with him through all his struggling, seemed to settle around him like a parent settling a blanket over a sleeping child. In the years that followed, other monks came to him, young, earnest, frustrated monks who had heard of the hermit on Samjiyon. They came with their own questions, their own hunger, and Hyun received them quietly, offered them tea, and gave each one the same simple phrase, "What is this?" Not as an answer, as a doorway that had no other side, because it opened not into somewhere else, but into the very place where they already stood. And as you listen now, let the words soften and dissolve like snow in morning light. You do not need to understand what you have just heard. Understanding is not what is being offered. What is being offered is simply this moment, this breath, this quiet darkness behind your closed eyes. What is this? Let the question float there, gentle and unhurried, like a leaf on still water. You do not need to answer it. Simply let it be there. Simply let yourself be here. Feel your body growing heavier, sinking deeper into the warmth beneath you. The mountain is patient. The question is patient. And so, gently, can you? And as that open, wondering stillness settles around you like snowfall on a silent night, we travel now across centuries and oceans to another tradition, where a monk in ancient India carried his own form of searching to its furthest edge before discovering that the path and the destination were never two separate things. Let your breath slow. Let your eyelids grow heavy. There is no hurry. The next story is already here, waiting in the stillness. Simply let yourself drift toward it, drawing from the teachings of the Chinese Chan tradition and the wisdom preserved in the encounter dialogues of the Tang Dynasty masters. We find this story of a woman whose restless searching took her across half of China before she discovered that the way had been sitting beside her at the kitchen table all along. In the province of Jiangxi, during the middle years of the Tang dynasty, there lived a woman named Mei. She was not a nun, not a scholar, not a practitioner of any formal kind. She was a rice farmer's wife, 34 years old, with calloused hands and a quiet face, and 2 children who were growing fast enough that she had to let out their clothes twice each summer. Her home was a small structure of bamboo and sun-dried brick at the edge of a village where the land flattened out into paddies that stretched toward a distant line of low hills, and where, on humid mornings, the water in those paddies steamed gently in the early light, the surface holding the sky like a mirror that had not yet decided to reflect. Mei had not come to Buddhism through books or teachers. She had come to it the way many in those villages did, through the slow accumulation of a feeling that there was something beneath the surface of ordinary life. Not beneath it in the way a fish is beneath water, hidden and waiting to be caught. Beneath it in the way the ground is beneath a garden, invisible, holding everything, asking nothing in return. This feeling had been with her as long as she could remember. As a girl, she had sometimes paused in the middle of carrying water from the well, the clay jar heavy against her hip, and felt something open in her chest, a quiet, sourceless expansion that had nothing to do with the water or the well or the weight of the jar, and everything to do with simply being there. In that moment, with the sun on her arms and the smell of wet earth and the sound of her mother calling from the kitchen, the feeling would last only a breath or two, and then it was gone, and she was a girl again, carrying water, and the moment closed behind her like water closing over a stone. Over the years, Mei learned to notice these moments. They came at odd times, while grinding rice in the mornings, while hanging laundry on the bamboo poles behind the house, while watching her children sleep at night with the oil lamp throwing shadows on the ceiling. Each time, the feeling arrived like a guest who appeared at the door without knocking, warm, unhurried, asking for nothing, and each time it left just as quietly, and each time Mei was left with a deeper and more persistent ache. Not the ache of grief, the ache of something almost remembered, something she could not quite grasp, no matter how still she held herself. It was in her 32nd year that a traveling monk passed through the village. He was old and thin, with a face like weathered wood, and he sat beneath a banyan tree near the edge of the market square and taught for 3 days. People came and went, drawn by curiosity or boredom or the simple novelty of a stranger. May went once, on the first day, and stood at the back of the small crowd with a basket of vegetables balanced on one hip, listening. The monk spoke simply. He said that the mind, in its deepest nature, was already awake, that what people called enlightenment was not something to be acquired, but something to be recognized, something that had always been present, underneath the noise of wanting and fearing and grasping. He said that the greatest masters of Chan had taught not through grand teachings, but through the most ordinary acts, pouring tea, washing bowls, walking in the garden. The way, he said, was not in some distant mountain monastery. It was here, in this breath, in this moment, in the weight of the basket on your hip and the smell of the market and the sound of your own heartbeat. May listened, and something in her stirred, not the feeling she knew exactly, but something adjacent to it, a recognition, as though the monk were describing a room she had glimpsed through a window but never entered. After the monk left the village, May could not stop thinking about what he had said. The feeling, the one that came and went like a guest, began to seem less like a random event and more like a clue to something she needed to find. And so, slowly, without announcing it to anyone, she began to search. At first, the searching was quiet. She sat in the mornings before dawn, while the children still slept, and tried to hold her mind very still, the way she imagined the monk meant when he spoke of meditation. She sat on the packed earth floor of the kitchen with her back against the wall and breathed slowly and watched for the feeling to come. Sometimes it did a flicker, a warmth, a brief loosening in her chest, and she would lean toward it with such eagerness that it vanished instantly, like a bird startled from a branch. And then she would sit for another hour, waiting, and it would not come again, and she would rise, feeling more frustrated than before she had begun. She began to ask questions of anyone who might have answers. A Buddhist nun who visited the village twice a year, a young scholar who had studied at a monastery before returning to take a position in the local government, an old farmer in a neighboring village who was said to have practiced meditation for 40 years and who, when May finally made the walk to see him, simply laughed and told her to go home and cook her rice. None of these conversations satisfied the hunger. Each answer opened another question. Each explanation created another layer of distance between May and the thing she was reaching for. The feeling itself, which had come so freely before, unbidden and undemanded, began to come less and less often, as though her searching had frightened it away. It was in her 34th year that May decided to leave the village. Her husband, a quiet man who understood her without needing her to explain, agreed to let her go. Her mother-in-law would care for the children. May packed a small bundle, a change of clothes, a little dried rice, a clay cup, and set out south along the roads that wound through the rice country of Jiangxi. She walked for weeks. The landscape unfolded around her in long, green waves paddies stepping down hillsides in terraced layers, bamboo groves rustling in the humid air, rivers brown with silt moving sluggishly toward the Yangtze. The heat was oppressive, the kind that settled on the skin like a wet cloth and did not lift even at night. She slept in travelers' inns when she could afford them, and in the open when she could not, curled on a mat beside the road with the sound of frogs filling the darkness. At each monastery she reached, she asked to be taught. Some monks received her. Others turned her away. At one monastery high in the hills above a tea-growing valley, she was given instruction in sitting meditation, hours each day in a stone hall that smelled of sandalwood and old wood, the air thick with incense smoke that curled upward in slow spirals toward the blackened ceiling. She sat and watched her breath and waited for the feeling to come, and it did not come. And she sat longer, and it still did not come. And after 2 weeks, she bowed to her teacher and continued south. At another monastery, nearer the coast, a young monk taught her a practice of watching thoughts arise and dissolve, like clouds forming and dispersing in the sky. She practiced this for days and found that she could observe her thoughts with a certain detachment, could watch them come and go without being carried along by them as she had always been before. This seemed like progress. It seemed like she was getting closer, and so she pushed harder, practicing longer hours, sitting through the night, eating less, sleeping less, driving herself with a discipline that left her body aching and her mind raw and exhausted. But the feeling did not come, or rather it came, once, on a cool night when she had given up trying and was simply sitting in the dark listening to crickets, and she felt it, that warm expansion, that sourceless opening, and she reached for it with such desperate attention that it was gone before she could even register that it had arrived. And after that, it did not come again for weeks. May had been walking for nearly 2 months when she reached a small monastery on the banks of a wide, slow river. The monastery was old and modest, a few wooden buildings arranged around a courtyard where a single plum tree grew, its branches bare in the autumn air. The head monk there was a woman named Lan Hua, who was perhaps 60 years old, with close-cropped grey hair and sharp, kind eyes. May arrived at dusk, tired and dusty, and Lan Hua received her without ceremony. She gave May a simple meal, plain rice, pickled vegetables, a cup of tea and a place to sleep. That night, after May had eaten and washed her face in cold water from a basin, Lan Hua sat with her in the small room and asked where she had come from and where she was going. May told her. She told her about the feeling that had come and gone since childhood, about the monk beneath the banyan tree, about the months of searching, the monasteries, the practices, the frustration, about how the harder she searched, the further away the thing seemed to move. Lan Hua listened to all of this without interrupting. When May finished, the old nun was quiet for a long time. Outside, the river murmured against the bank, a low and continuous sound, and somewhere in the darkness a night bird called once and was silent. Then Lan Hua said, "Tell me, when you were walking here today, along the road, what did you notice?" May thought about it. "The river," she said. "The color of the water in the late light, and the smell of smoke from the village we passed. Someone was cooking something, fish, I think, with ginger. And when you ate just now," Lan Hua said, "what did you notice?" "The rice was good. Simple. The tea was warm." Lan Hua nodded slowly. She picked up her own cup, held it in both hands, and drank. The tea was pale green, and the steam rose from it in a thin, wavering line. "You have walked 2 months," she said, "searching for something you have already found. You noticed the color of the river. You noticed the smell of cooking fish. You noticed the warmth of the tea and the taste of the rice. This noticing, this quiet, open awareness of what is simply here, this is the thing you have been searching for. It has been with you the entire time. It was with you when you carried water as a child. It was with you in your kitchen every morning. It walked with you along the road today. You do not need to find it, Mai. You only need to stop looking past it." May sat with this for a long time. The river continued its quiet murmuring. The plum tree in the courtyard was still and dark against the night sky. And something in May, not a thought, not an idea, But something older and quieter than either began, very slowly, to settle. She stayed at the monastery for 3 days. She did not practice meditation in any formal way. She did not sit for hours in silence. She simply lived, helped with the cooking, carried water from the river, swept the courtyard in the cool mornings when the mist hung low over the water. And in each of these tasks, she began to notice, not with effort, but with a gentle, returning attention, the feeling she had spent 2 months chasing. It was there in the weight of the water bucket. It was there in the sound of the broom against the packed earth. It was there in the warmth of the sun on her hands as she hung laundry to dry on a line strung between 2 posts. On the morning she left, Lanhua walked with her to the edge of the monastery grounds. The river was silver in the early light, and mist curled off its surface in long, pale ribbons. "When you get home," Lanhua said, "do not try to hold on to what you have found here. Simply live. Cook your rice. Watch your children grow. Drink your tea. The way does not ask you to find it. It only asks you to stop stepping over it." May bowed. She turned and began the long walk north, back toward the village and the paddies and the life she had left 2 months before. The road wound through the rice country, and the morning light fell across the water in the fields, and frogs sang in the ditches, and the air smelled of mud and green, growing things. And May walked, and noticed, and did not search, and found nothing she did not already have. She arrived home on a grey afternoon in late autumn. Her husband was in the field. Her children ran to her from the kitchen, and she knelt and held them, and felt the weight of their small bodies against hers, and the warmth of them, and the sound of their breathing, and something opened in her chest, quiet, sourceless, unhurried, and this time she did not reach for it. She simply let it be there, and it stayed. And as you listen now, let the words settle like sediment drifting slowly to the bottom of still water. You do not need to grasp what May discovered. You do not need to understand it with your thinking mind. Simply notice this breath, this warmth, this quiet darkness behind your closed eyes. The thing you have been searching for has never left you. It is here. It is now. It is the very awareness that is listening. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw release. Feel the weight of your body held beneath you, steady and warm. The river does not search for the sea. It simply flows and arrives without effort, without hurry. And as that deep, unhurried stillness settles around you, like mist settling over still water at dawn, we travel now across the centuries and across the sea to the island of Sri Lanka, where an ancient tradition preserved a teaching about the nature of suffering and about how the very act of trying to escape it became, for one monk, the doorway through which suffering finally dissolved. Let your breath slow. Let your eyelids grow heavier still. There is nothing to do but rest here. The next story is already waiting, quiet and patient, like a lamp burning softly in another room. From the Theravada tradition of Sri Lanka, drawing from the ancient teachings preserved in the Pali Canon, we find this story of a monk who spent years believing that the way out of suffering was to defeat it, until the night he learned that the suffering he could not escape was never the wound that truly hurt him. In the forests east of Anuradhapura, in the years when that ancient city still served as the heart of Sri Lanka's kingdom, there stretched a vast and tangled wilderness that few people entered and fewer still chose to make their home. The trees there were enormous ironwood and palmyra palms, rising so high that their canopies blocked the sun entirely, leaving the forest floor in a permanent green twilight, damp and warm and thick with the smell of moss and decaying leaves. At night, the jungle filled with sound, the calls of insects rising and falling in waves, the occasional cry of a bird, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth. Rain came often, sometimes without warning, a sudden hammering on the canopy that turned the ground to mud and sent water streaming down the trunks of ancient trees in silver ribbons. It was in this forest, in one of the many small kutis scattered among the trees, that a monk named Kumara lived alone. Kumara was 43 years old. He had been a monk for 22 years, having entered the Sangha at 21 after a childhood spent in a fishing village on the coast, where his father mended nets and his mother dried fish on wooden racks in the salt wind. He had been a quiet boy, more given to watching than to speaking, watching the waves, watching the gulls, watching the way the light changed on the water as the day turned. Something in that watching had drawn him, eventually, toward the monastic life, though he could not have said precisely why. It was not ambition. It was not even, exactly, a hunger for spiritual knowledge. It was closer to a feeling that the watching itself, that quiet, open attention to what was simply happening, was the most honest thing he knew how to do. He had spent his early years as a monk in the large monasteries near Anuradhapura, learning the Pali Canon, memorizing suttas, studying under teachers who had devoted their lives to the preservation and transmission of the Buddha's teachings. He was diligent and sincere, and the older monks respected him for his steadiness and his lack of vanity. But it was not until he was 35 that he found the teacher who changed everything. His name was Siripada. He was an old man by then, perhaps 70, though no one knew his exact age, with a face so lined and calm that it seemed to have been carved from the same ironwood as the trees around his kuti. He lived alone in the deep forest, east of the main monastery complex, in a small shelter of bamboo and dried palm leaves that he had built himself. He ate once a day, walking barefoot to the nearest village at dawn to receive alms, and the rest of his time he spent in sitting and walking meditation, moving through the forest with such quiet attentiveness that the deer did not always flee when he passed. Kumara first went to Siripada on the advice of another monk who had studied with him years earlier. He walked into the forest for half a day, following a path so faint it was barely distinguishable from the surrounding undergrowth, until he came to the small clearing where Siripada's kuti stood. The old monk was sitting outside, on a flat stone beneath a palmyra palm, and he looked up when Kumar approached with eyes that were very dark and very still. They did not exchange many words that first day. Siripada offered him water, plain water, carried from a stream in a clay vessel, and they sat together in silence for a long time, listening to the forest. A gecko clicked somewhere in the thatch above them. A breeze moved through the upper canopy, and a shower of dried leaves drifted down like slow, brown snow. And in that silence, Kumara felt something he had not felt in years of formal practice, a quality of ease, of being entirely present without any effort or intention behind the presence, as though the forest itself were teaching him something, and Siripada were simply sitting there as proof that it could be learned. He began visiting Siripada regularly, once a week at first, then twice. Then finally, he moved into a kuti of his own nearby, and the two monks lived in companionable silence for 3 years. Siripada taught very little through words. Occasionally he would share a passage from the suttas, reading it aloud in his quiet, unhurried voice, and then they would sit with it together, not discussing it but simply holding it in the mind, the way one might hold a smooth stone, feeling its weight. More often, the teaching came through example, through watching how Siripada moved through his days, how he ate, how he swept the ground around his kuti with the same gentle attention he brought to sitting meditation. How he met each moment as it arose without adding anything to it. It was during these years that Kumara first began to truly understand the teaching of the two arrows, the teaching from the Salatha Sutta that the Buddha had given long ago to his monks. The first arrow, the Buddha had said, is the pain that life brings: illness, loss, disappointment, the inevitable sorrows that no one can avoid. This arrow strikes everyone. But the second arrow, the one that causes the deepest suffering, is the arrow we fire ourselves. It is the resistance to the pain, the story we tell about it, the anger and the fear and the self-blame that pile upon the original wound like stones piled on an already broken body. The first arrow, the Buddha taught, cannot always be avoided. But the second arrow is optional. Kumara understood this teaching intellectually long before he understood it in his bones. He could explain it clearly to other monks. He could see, in his own experience, how he added layers of suffering to difficulties that were already painful, how a headache became not just a headache, but evidence that his body was failing him, how a disagreement with another monk became not just an uncomfortable exchange, but proof that he was not yet the practitioner he should be. He could see the second arrow being fired, again and again, and yet he could not stop firing it. The seeing and the doing remained separate, like two rooms in the same house with no door between them. It was Siripada who finally opened that door, though he did not do it through teaching. He did it through dying. Siripada fell ill in the dry season, when the forest was at its hottest and the air hung thick and still, like a curtain of warm cloth. The illness came on quietly, a cough first, then a fever, then a deepening weakness that kept him on his sleeping mat for days at a time. Kumara tended him as best he could, bringing water, bringing the simple foods that might ease the fever, sitting with him through the long nights when the jungle sounds pressed in from all sides and the old monk's breathing was shallow and labored in the darkness. During those weeks, Kumara noticed something remarkable about Siripada. The old monk did not resist his illness. He did not rail against it or fear it or treat it as an enemy to be conquered. He simply lay with it, meeting each wave of pain as it came with the same quiet attention he had always brought to everything else. When the pain was sharp, he acknowledged it, a slight tightening around the eyes, a slow exhalation, and then he was still again, present and calm, as though the pain was simply another sound in the forest, another movement in the endless dance of arising and passing away. One night, near the end, when the fever had broken but the weakness had deepened so that Siripada could barely lift his head, Kumara sat beside him in the darkness, listening to his breathing. The old monk spoke only once that night. His voice was very faint, barely above a whisper. "The pain is not the wound," he said. "The wound is the fighting." And then he was quiet again, and sometime before dawn, his breathing stopped, and the forest continued its endless chorus as though nothing at all had changed. Kumara sat with the body until morning. He performed the rituals that tradition required, the offerings, the chanting, the careful preparation for cremation. He did all of this with steady hands and a calm face. But inside, something was breaking. Not the sharp, dramatic breaking of grief that arrives all at once, but a slow, grinding crack, like a foundation shifting beneath a building, felt more than seen. The grief, when it finally came not as tears, but as a vast and sourceless ache that settled into his chest and would not leave. It was there when he woke in the mornings, there when he sat in meditation, there when he walked the forest paths alone in the grey light before dawn. It was there when he heard a sound that reminded him of Siripada, the click of a gecko, the rustle of leaves, the particular quality of silence in the forest at midday. The grief was not painful in the way a sharp wound is painful. It was more like weather, a permanent climate that colored everything, that made the air feel heavier and the light feel dimmer and the world feel emptier than it had before. And then, slowly, and without Kumara's permission, the second arrow began to fly. It started as a whisper. Why did you not recognize the signs sooner? You could have sought medicine. You could have asked the village healers. You sat there and watched him die when perhaps he could have been saved. And then the whisper grew louder. You are not ready. You have practiced for 20 years and you cannot even bear the loss of one teacher without falling apart. What kind of monk are you? And louder still, this grief will never end. You will carry it forever. It will hollow you out until there is nothing left. The second arrow struck deeper than the first. The grief itself, the simple, honest ache of missing someone he loved, was bearable. Kumara knew this, somewhere beneath the noise of his own mind. But the stories he told about the grief, the judgments, and the fears that piled upon it like stones, these were unbearable. And the more he tried to push them away, the harder they pressed in. Months passed. The dry season gave way to the rains, and the rains gave way to the cooler months. And Kumara sat in his kuti and meditated and walked and ate and slept and carried his grief like a stone in his chest. And the second arrow flew and flew and flew, and he could not make it stop. It was on a night in the cool season, perhaps 6 months after Siripada's death, that the door finally opened. Kumara had been sitting in meditation since evening, in the small shelter beside his kuti where the bamboo walls let in the sounds of the night forest. The rain had stopped an hour before, and the air was clean and cool and smelled of wet earth and green leaves. The insects sang their endless chorus. A frog called from somewhere near the stream, and the grief was there, as it always was, a weight in his chest, a quiet ache behind his eyes. He sat with it, not fighting it, not trying to dissolve it, or understand it, or transcend it. Simply sitting with it, the way Siripada had sat with his pain, meeting it where it was, without adding anything to it. And as he sat, he began to notice something he had not noticed before. The grief was there, but underneath the grief, or rather, surrounding it, holding it the way water holds a stone, there was something else, something vast and quiet and utterly undisturbed, something that felt the grief without being changed by it, the way the sky feels the passage of clouds without being altered in any way. The grief moved through this space like weather moving through an open room, present, real, acknowledged, and then it moved on, and the space remained, clear and unchanged. Kumara sat with this recognition for a very long time. The night deepened around him. The jungle sang its ancient songs, and slowly, very slowly, the second arrow, the resistance, the judgment, the fear began to lose its grip. Not because he had conquered it, not because he had understood it intellectually or found the right practice to dissolve it, but simply because he had finally stopped firing it. He had stopped adding his own suffering to the suffering that was already there. The grief did not disappear that night. It remained with him for many more months, quieter now, gentler, no longer a wound, but simply a weather, something that came and went, like rain, like wind, like the endless arising and passing away of all things. And beneath it, always, the vast and quiet space that held everything without being harmed by anything. Years later, when younger monks came to live near him in the forest and asked him what he had learned from his teacher, Kumara would simply smile and say nothing for a while. And then, if they asked again, he might say this: "The first arrow will come. It comes for everyone. But the second arrow, the one you fire yourself, that is the one that truly wounds. And the moment you see it for what it is, the moment you set it down, you discover that the space beneath the pain was never broken. It was never broken at all. And as you listen now, let the words dissolve like mist burning off in morning sun. You do not need to carry anything away from this story. The teaching is not something to hold on to with your thinking mind. It is something to feel in your body, in this moment, in this breath. Whatever pain is present in you tonight, and there may be some, because you are human and humans feel simply, let it be there. Do not add to it. Do not fight it. Simply let it exist in the same space where your breath exists, where your heartbeat exists, where this quiet, listening awareness exists. The space is large enough. It has always been large enough. Feel your body soften. Feel the weight of you, held and supported beneath you. Let your jaw release. Let your hands uncurl. There is nothing to defend against tonight. The forest is singing, and the rain has stopped, and you are here, and that is enough. And as that deep and unbroken stillness settles around you like the cool air after rain, we travel now across the ocean and across the centuries to the mountains of Tibet, where an ancient tradition preserved a different kind of story, not about a monk in a forest, but about a woman on a mountain, and about the moment she discovered that the self she had been protecting so fiercely was never the thing that needed protecting. Let your breath slow. Let your eyelids grow heavier. The next story is already here, patient and quiet, like a lamp burning in the next room. Simply let yourself drift toward it. In the spirit of the Nyingma tradition of Tibet, drawing from the ancient Dzogchen teachings on Rigpa, the primordial awareness that is not something to be found, but something already present, we find this story of a woman who spent the better part of her life defending a self she believed needed defending, until the mountain showed her there was nothing to defend. Dorje was 38 years old when she left her village for the mountain. She had not planned to leave. She had not planned anything. The leaving happened the way some things happen, not as a decision, but as a movement. The way water finds its way downhill without deciding to flow. One morning in the last cold weeks before the valley greened, she simply rose before dawn, dressed in her heavy woolen chuba, wrapped her hair in its cloth, and walked out of the house where she had lived for 14 years, past the garden where barley grew thin and pale in the rocky soil, past the pen where 2 yaks stood, breathing clouds of vapor into the freezing air, and onto the path that wound up the mountain. Her village sat in one of the deep river valleys of calm, at a place where the gorge widened enough for a few dozen stone houses to cluster together on the valley floor. The houses were built of dark grey stone, their wooden frames painted in fading reds and blues, with turquoise and gold designs around the window frames that had been there since Dorje's grandmother's time. Prayer flags snapped and whispered on strings strung between rooftops, their colors bleached by years of sun and wind. The river ran through the center of the village, loud and brown with silt, and in spring, the slopes above turned briefly green before the snow crept back down. Dorje had grown up in this village. Her father had been a trader who carried salt and wool along the mountain passes, sometimes disappearing for weeks at a time and returning with stories of distant places, monasteries carved into cliffsides, lakes so blue they hurt the eyes, monks who sat in caves for years without speaking. Her mother had been quieter, a woman who kept the household with steady hands and little comment, who made butter tea in the mornings and barley tsampa in the afternoons, and who, in the evenings, sat by the fire and chanted mantras so softly that the words blurred into a kind of humming, like wind through a keyhole. Dorje had inherited her father's curiosity and her mother's stubbornness. As a young woman, she had been sharp-tongued and quick to argue, known in the village for her intelligence and for her refusal to be moved by other people's opinions. She had married at 22, a quiet man named Tenzin, who repaired tools and kept a small garden, and had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who were now 11 and 9. She loved them fiercely, with a love that felt almost violent in its intensity, and she had organized her entire life around keeping them safe, fed, warm, and close. But something had been happening inside her for several years, something she could not name and could not stop. It had begun, or perhaps it had first become noticeable, when she was 34. She had been sitting outside one evening, after the children were asleep and Tenzin was mending a harness by lamplight, and she had looked up at the mountains and felt, for just a moment, something dissolve. Not disappear, dissolve, the way salt dissolves in water, becoming part of something larger without ceasing to exist. The feeling lasted only a breath or two, and then it was gone, and she was herself again, Dorje, wife of Tenzin, mother of 2, keeper of a small household in a valley in calm. But the memory of that dissolving stayed with her like a taste she could not quite identify, returning again and again in the weeks and months that followed. It happened again and again. Sometimes, while she was grinding barley, the rhythm of the pestle becoming so steady that her hands moved without her mind directing them. And in that gap between intention and action, the dissolving would come a sudden expansion, as though the walls of herself had become transparent and she could feel the air, the light, the sound of the river, not as things outside her, but as things she was made of. And then it would pass, and she would be Dorje again, and the pestle would be heavy in her hands, and the barley would smell of earth and dust. She began to notice a pattern. The dissolving came when she was not trying to make it come. It came when her mind was occupied with something so simple and so repetitive that it forgot, for a moment, to maintain its usual vigilance, its constant watching and judging and planning and worrying. And when she noticed it was happening and tried to hold on to it, it vanished instantly, like a bird that flies away the moment you reach for it. This frustrated her. Dorje was not accustomed to frustration. She was accustomed to solving problems, to making things work, to wrestling the world into a shape that made sense. So she began to pursue the dissolving deliberately. She sat in meditation, as she had seen monks do, trying to still her mind. She watched her breath. She tried to empty her thoughts. And the harder she tried, the more her mind churned, filling itself with questions and doubts and a mounting irritation at its own failure to cooperate. It was her mother who, without meaning to, gave her the first clue. One evening, near the end of winter, Dorje asked her about the mantras she chanted by the fire each night. Her mother looked at her with mild surprise. They had never discussed this before, and said simply, "I chant because it gives my hands something to do while my heart rests." Dorje turned this over for weeks. Her hands something to do while her heart rests. It was such a small thing to say, and yet it pointed towards something she could not quite grasp, something about the relationship between effort and stillness, between doing and being, that her own attempts at meditation had missed entirely. And then, on that cold morning in late winter, she left. She did not tell Tenzin where she was going. She left a note, just a few words, written in her careful hand, saying she needed to go to the mountain for a time, and that she trusted him to care for the children. He would understand, or he would not, but either way she knew he would keep the children fed and warm. Tenzin was not a man who asked many questions. The path up the mountain was one she had walked many times before, up to the meadow where they sometimes grazed the yaks in summer, and beyond that, to the small cave where, according to village stories, a monk had once lived alone for 30 years. She had never been to the cave herself. She climbed for most of the morning, the air growing thinner and sharper with each 100 meters of elevation, the valley falling away behind her in layers of grey and brown and pale green. The wind was cold and very dry, carrying the smell of dust and old snow. Prayer flags on a distant ridge snapped and crackled. Above her, the peaks rose white and still against a sky so deep and clear it seemed almost black at the edges. The cave was exactly where the stories said it would be, a natural hollow in the rock face, deep enough to shelter from the wind, with a flat stone floor and an opening that faced east, toward the rising sun. Someone had been here before her. Long ago, there were the remnants of an old fire pit, blackened stones arranged in a circle, and a few fragments of pottery half buried in the dust. She swept the floor clean with her hands, arranged a sleeping mat she had carried on her back, and sat down facing the opening. For the first 3 days, her mind was a storm. Every thought she had ever carried about herself came flooding in about who she was, what she owed to her family, whether she had made a terrible mistake by leaving, whether Tenzin would manage, whether the children would cry for her, whether she was selfish, whether she was brave, whether this whole endeavor was foolish. The thoughts came in waves, each one pulling her deeper into a tangle of story and emotion, and each time she tried to push them away, they returned with greater force, like water pushing against a dam. She did not fight them. This was the one thing she had learned from watching her mother, that the chanting was not meant to silence the mind, but to give it something gentle to do while something else, something quieter, simply rested. So Dorje let the thoughts come. She watched them arise and pass, the way she watched clouds move across the mountain without grabbing at them, without pushing them away, simply letting them be what they were. On the 4th day, the storm began to quiet. Not because the thoughts stopped, they did not, but because she stopped believing they were the whole of what she was. She began to notice something beneath them, or behind them, or perhaps surrounding them, a quality of awareness that was present regardless of what the thoughts were doing. It was like noticing, for the first time, that the sky exists behind the clouds. The clouds had always been there, moving and changing, but the sky vast, clear, unchanging had been there all along, invisible only because she had been looking at the clouds and mistaking them for everything. On the 7th morning, she woke before dawn to find snow falling soft, thick, ailant, filling the air with white. She sat at the mouth of the cave and watched it fall, and as she watched, something shifted. It was not a dramatic shift, not a flash of light or a sudden revelation. It was quieter than that, more like a long-held breath finally being released. She felt the dissolving again, the same expansion she had felt in the valley, but this time she did not reach for it. She simply allowed it to happen, the way she allowed the snow to fall without resistance, without grasping, without any story about what it meant. And in that allowing, she discovered something that undid everything she had spent her life believing about herself. The self she had been protecting, the Dorje, who was sharp and strong and vigilant, who held her family together through force of will, who refused to be moved or changed or broken. This self was not, as she had always assumed, the deepest thing in her. It was a layer, a useful layer, perhaps, one that had served her well in a life that required strength and determination. But beneath it, or rather pervading it, there was something else, something that had no name and no edges, and no story attached to it. Something that had been present all along, beneath every thought, beneath every feeling, beneath every moment of effort and struggle and love and fear. Something that was not hers, exactly, and not anyone else's, but simply was, the way the sky simply is, whether or not anyone is looking at it. She sat with this for a very long time. The snow continued to fall. The mountains were white and silent. And Dorje, or the part of her that was still Dorje, still a woman with a name and a history and a family waiting in the valley below, felt something release. Not the release of giving up. The release of finally setting down something very heavy that she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. She stayed on the mountain for 11 days. Each day the dissolving came more easily, or rather it was always there, and she simply stopped obscuring it with the noise of her own vigilance. She ate sparingly a little tsampa she had brought, mixed with snowmelt water. She sat in the mornings and watched the light change on the peaks. She walked the rocky ground around the cave in the afternoons, feeling the cold wind on her face, the crunch of frost beneath her feet, the extraordinary thinness and clarity of the air at this altitude. And gradually, very gradually, the boundary between Dorje the woman and the vast unnamed awareness she had discovered began to soften, not disappearing, but becoming permeable, like a window that had been painted shut, finally opened. On the 11th morning, she packed her mat, swept the cave clean, and began the long walk down. Tenzin was standing outside when she reached the village, as though he had been waiting. He did not ask where she had been or why. He looked at her face for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he understood more than words could carry. He simply nodded, and she nodded back, and they went inside together where the children were still sleeping, their breathing soft and even in the grey morning light. In the years that followed, Dorje did not become a teacher or a monk or a hermit. She remained in the village, grinding barley, mending clothes, raising her children, helping her neighbors when they needed help. But something had changed in the way she moved through her days, a quality of ease, of spaciousness, that had not been there before. She no longer spent so much energy defending the borders of herself. She could be strong when strength was needed, and she could be still when stillness was called for. And between these two there was a vast and quiet space in which she simply lived, without the constant effort of becoming someone. When her daughter, years later, asked her what she had found on the mountain, Dorje was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I found that the thing I was protecting was not the deepest thing. And the deepest thing does not need protecting. It has never needed protecting. It has always been there, beneath everything, waiting not for us to find it, but for us to stop looking. And as you rest here now, in this moment, let those words settle not in your thinking mind, but somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath thought, beneath story, beneath the tireless effort of becoming. You do not need to understand what Dorje understood. Understanding is not the door. The door is simply this, the quiet awareness that is already present, right now, in this breath, in this body, holding everything you are without effort and without strain. It has always been here. It is here now. There is nothing to defend. There is nothing to find. There is only this vast, clear, and entirely at peace. Feel your body grow heavier. Feel the darkness behind your closed eyes, soft and warm and without edges. Let the mountain's silence travel with you into sleep. You are already there. And as that boundless stillness deepens around you like snow settling on still ground, we travel now across the centuries and the seas to the ancient island of Sri Lanka once more, not to the forests this time, but to the shores, where the waves have been washing against the rocks since long before anyone thought to listen. A story waits there, carried on the breath of the ocean, about a fisherman's widow who learned that the deepest peace is not something you find at the end of grief, but something that has been breathing inside the grief all along. Let your breath slow. Let your hands grow still. The next story is already here, patient as the tide. Simply let yourself drift toward it, drawing from the Theravada wisdom of Sri Lanka, and from the ancient teaching that the self we cling to is not a fixed thing but a river, always moving, always changing, never the same. From one moment to the next, we find this story of a woman on the shore who spent 3 years believing she was her grief, until the ocean taught her otherwise. Her name was Nagasena, not the monk of that name from the ancient texts, but a woman, a fisherman's widow, who lived in a small village on the southern coast of Sri Lanka, in a place where the land curved inward like a cupped hand, and the rocks jutted out into the sea in dark, salt-worn shelves. The village had no name that outsiders would have known. It was simply called the fishing place by those who lived nearby. A handful of families clustered on the slope above the beach, their houses built of coral stone and timber, whitewashed, where the walls had not yet been darkened by years of salt, wind, and cooking smoke. The roofs were thatched with palmyra leaves, and in the mornings, when the mist still lay on the water, the whole village smelled of fish drying on wooden racks in long silver rows along the shore, and of coconut oil heating in clay pots, and of the particular clean sharpness of the Indian Ocean itself. That smell that was neither fresh nor stale but ancient, as though the water carried the memory of every shore it had ever touched. Nagasena had lived here all her life. She was 31 when her husband died. His name was Mahinda, a common name in those villages, one that several men in the area shared. He was not a remarkable man in any way that strangers would have noticed. He was of medium height, with hands roughened by years of handling nets and lines, and a face that was usually calm and slightly weathered, like driftwood that has been smoothed by long exposure to sun and salt. He laughed easily, though quietly, and he knew the sea the way some people know a language they were born into, not through learning, but through a kind of wordless fluency that could not be taught. He went out one morning in the dry season, before dawn, in the small outrigger canoe they shared with 2 other fishermen. The sea that day was calm, a flat grey mirror under a sky that was just beginning to lighten at the edges. He did not come back. The other 2 fishermen returned at midday, sunburned and shaken. The canoe had capsized in a sudden squall that had come from nowhere, a wall of wind that appeared without warning, turned the boat on its side, and was gone again in minutes. They had clung to the hull and been pulled to shore by the current. Mahinda had not surfaced. They searched for 3 days. They found nothing. On the 4th day, the village elder came to Nagasena and told her, gently, that it was time to accept what had happened. She nodded. She performed the rituals that tradition required, the offerings at the small shrine near the beach, the chanting, the prayers spoken in the old words that no one fully understood anymore, but that everyone repeated faithfully, as though the meaning lived in the shape of the sounds rather than in their translation. And then the grief came. It came not as a sudden wave, but as a slow filling, the way water fills a vessel left open in the rain, rising quietly, without drama, until one morning she woke and found herself completely submerged. Everything she saw, everything she touched, everything she heard was colored by his absence. The sound of the waves, which she had once found peaceful, now sounded hollow, like an empty room. The smell of fish drying in the sun, which had been the smell of their life together, now made her chest ache with a pain that had no location. It was everywhere and nowhere, inside her body and outside it at the same time. She continued to live. She cooked. She mended nets, because the nets still needed mending, and because the work kept her hands busy and her mind occupied with something other than the endless loop of memory and loss. She walked to the well each morning for water, carrying the clay pot on her head, the way women in the village had carried it for generations. She ate when she remembered to eat. She slept when exhaustion finally pulled her under, and even then, the sleep was thin and restless, threaded through with dreams in which Mahinda was still alive, and she was trying to tell him something important that she could never quite remember when she woke. What made the grief so difficult to bear was not its intensity, though it was intense, but the way it had become her identity. Somewhere in those first weeks and months, Nagasena had stopped being a woman who was grieving and had become grief itself. The grief was no longer something she felt, it was something she was. When people spoke to her, she answered from inside the grief. When she looked at the sea, she looked through the grief. The grief was the lens through which every moment was filtered, and she had forgotten that there had ever been a time when she saw the world without it. A monk came to the village once a month, walking along the coastal path from a monastery further inland. His name was Bardanta, and he was an old man, perhaps 60, though in those days, monks did not always keep careful count of their years. He walked barefoot, carrying nothing but a small cloth bag for alms, and he moved along the path with the unhurried steadiness of someone for whom the journey itself was the practice. When he arrived in the village, he would sit beneath the shade of a large banyan tree near the beach, and the villagers would bring him food, rice and fish, and sometimes fruit, and in return he would sit with them quietly, or teach, or simply be present in that way that some monks have, which feels less like companionship and more like a kind of gentle weather. It was Bardanta who first spoke to Nagasena about her grief, though not in the way she expected. He did not offer comfort. He did not tell her that her husband was in a better place, or that time would heal the wound, or any of the other things that well-meaning people said, which only made the grief feel more isolated, more unspeakable. Instead, one evening, when she had come to sit near the banyan tree after bringing him his meal, he asked her a question. He asked it simply, without any particular emphasis, the way one might ask about the weather. "When you look at the ocean," he said, "do you see the same water each time you look?" She considered this. She knew, as anyone who lived by the sea would know, that the water was always moving, carried by currents and tides and wind, replaced constantly by new water flowing in and old water flowing out. No wave was the same as any other wave. No handful of water scooped from the sea today was the same handful that had been there yesterday. "No," she said. "It is always different." Bardanta nodded. "And yet," he said, "you call it the ocean. You recognize it. You know where it is. The name stays, even though the water it names is never still." He said nothing more that evening. He did not explain what he meant or draw the lesson out. He simply sat with her in silence while the sun went down and the waves moved in their endless rhythm against the rocks. But something about what he had said stayed with her, like a seed dropped in wet ground. She turned it over in her mind during the days that followed, not trying to understand it, but simply holding it, letting it sit alongside the grief without trying to make the two of them fit together into a single shape. It was 3 months later, on a night when the moon was full and the beach was flooded with silver light, that she first began to see what Bardanta had been pointing toward. She had walked down to the shore, as she often did in the evenings, and she sat on one of the dark rock shelves that jutted out over the water. The waves came in steadily, breaking against the rocks in white foam and then pulling back, and each wave was different in size, in force. In the exact way it struck the stone and dissolved. She watched them for a long time, and as she watched, she began to notice something she had not noticed before. The grief was there, as it always was, a heaviness in her chest, a dull ache behind her eyes, a constant low hum of loss that colored everything. But it was not the only thing there. Beneath it, or around it, or perhaps simply alongside it, there was something else, something that watched the grief the way she was watching the waves. Something that felt the pain without being the pain. Something that was aware of the grief moving through her, the way the shore is aware of the waves moving across it, receiving them, being shaped by them, and yet remaining underneath, unchanged. She sat with this for a very long time. The moon moved slowly across the sky. The waves continued their endless arriving and departing. And gradually, very gradually, she began to understand what the monk had been trying to show her. She was not the grief. She had never been the grief. The grief was a wave, real, powerful, present, but she was the shore. The shore that received the wave without being destroyed by it. The shore that remained after every wave had come and gone. This did not make the grief disappear. It did not diminish it, or explain it, or dissolve it in any way. The waves still came, still broke against the rocks with force, still left the stone wet and gleaming in their wake. But something had shifted in the way she experienced them. The grief was no longer the whole of her. It was something moving through her, something that arose and passed, like everything else in this world, and beneath the movement, beneath the constant arising and passing away, there was a stillness that had always been there, patient and quiet, waiting not to be found, but simply to be noticed. In the weeks that followed, Nagasena began to notice this stillness more and more often. It was there when she carried the water pot from the well. It was there when she mended the nets, her hands moving in their familiar rhythm. It was there in the mornings, in the moment before full waking, when the mind had not yet assembled its daily cargo of memory and expectation. It was there at night, in the silence between the waves, in the darkness behind her closed eyes. It did not have a name. It did not feel like happiness or peace or any other emotion she could identify. It simply was a quality of awareness that preceded all feeling, all thought, all story. And as this awareness deepened, the grief began very slowly, over months, to change. Not to disappear, but to soften, to become less like a weight she carried and more like weather she moved through. Some days it was heavy, and she felt it fully, and she did not push it away or try to fix it. She simply let it be there, the way the shore lets the wave be there, receiving it completely, without resistance, and then watching it pull back into the sea. Badanta came again at the end of the month, as he always did. He sat beneath the banyan tree and ate the rice and fish she brought him, and when she sat beside him, he looked at her face for a long moment, with eyes that were very calm and very old. He did not ask her what she had learned. He did not need to. Something in the way she sat, the ease of it, the quietness told him everything. They sat together in silence as the evening came on, listening to the waves, and the silence between them was not empty but full of the ocean's endless rhythm, full of the wind moving through the banyan's leaves, full of the simple, unhurried fact of two people existing in the same place at the same time and finding that enough. Years later, when other women in the village came to her in grief, and they did, because grief visits every fishing village, Sooner or later, Nagasena did not offer them words of comfort or advice. She simply sat with them. Sometimes she would say, very quietly, "Watch the waves." And sometimes she would say nothing at all, because the teaching was not in the words, but in the watching, in the slow, patient noticing that the grief is real and the grief is moving, and beneath the grief, beneath all the moving, there is something that does not move, something that has never moved, something that holds everything, the joy and the sorrow, the arriving and the departing, without being changed by any of it. And as you listen now, let the sound of those waves carry you somewhere very quiet. You do not need to hold on to anything from this story. You do not need to understand or remember or carry any teaching with you into sleep. The teaching is already inside you, not as knowledge, but as a quality of awareness, a stillness beneath the movement of your thoughts and feelings that has always been there, patient as the shore, quiet as the space between waves. Feel it now, if you can, or simply trust that it is there, even if you cannot feel it yet. It is there. It has always been there. Let your body grow very still. Let your breath come and go like a tide, in and out, and notice how, between each breath, there is a moment of perfect stillness. Rest in that stillness. It is yours. It has always been yours. And as that stillness deepens and the world grows very quiet around you, we travel now one final time, not across an ocean or a mountain range, but inward, to the quietest place there is. The last story waits for you there, in the tradition of the Vietnamese Zen, and it asks nothing of you at all. It simply invites you to dissolve gently, completely, like mist burning off at dawn, into the peace that was always waiting beneath everything you have ever been. Let your eyes close if they have not already. Let your hands go slack. The final story is already here, breathing softly in the dark. Simply let yourself drift toward it, the way a leaf drifts on still water without effort, without direction, carried by something older and quieter than thought. In the spirit of Vietnamese Zen, drawing from the quiet wisdom of the Truc Lam tradition, which teaches that awakening is not a distant event, but the simple, unhurried recognition of what has always been present in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life, we find this final story. It is not a story of seeking or finding. It is a story of a woman who stopped, and in that stopping, discovered that the peace she had carried her whole life without knowing it was there. Her name was Lien. She was 63 years old, and she lived alone in a small house at the edge of a village in the northern countryside of Vietnam, in a place where the land rose gently from the lowlands into a series of soft hills covered with rice paddies and bamboo groves. The house was made of wood and clay, with a thatched roof that sagged slightly on one side where the bamboo supports had bent under years of rain. It was not large, a single room with a sleeping mat in one corner, a low wooden table near the window, a clay stove where she cooked her meals, and a small altar in the back where a statue of the Buddha sat among dried flowers and the faint residue of incense smoke that had accumulated over decades. The window faced east, and in the mornings, when the mist was still thick on the paddies, the light that came through it was not the hard light of midday, but something softer, a diffused, golden glow that filled the room without casting shadows, as though the light itself were breathing. Lian had been a schoolteacher for 31 years. She had taught the children of the village to read and write and count, and she had done this with a patience that the children's parents sometimes remarked upon, a steadiness that never seemed to waver. No matter how difficult the child, no matter how many times the same lesson had to be repeated, she had married young, to a man named Hoa who worked the rice paddies, and they had had 3 children, and Hoa had died when the youngest was 12, quietly, of an illness that came and went for 2 seasons before it finally took him. One grey morning in late autumn, when the paddies had already been harvested and the fields were bare and brown, Lien had grieved, and then she had continued, because the children needed her and because continuing was what she knew how to do. She had retired from teaching 5 years before this story takes place. Her children had grown and moved to the cities, to Hanoi, to Haiphong, and they called her sometimes on the telephone, and sometimes they came to visit, bringing their own children, who ran through the paddies barefoot and splashed in the irrigation ditches and filled the house with noise and laughter and then left again. And the silence that settled after their departure was not empty but full, like a bowl that has been filled and emptied and filled again, still holding the faint warmth of what it once contained. Now Lien lived alone, and she was not lonely. This is the first thing that must be understood about her, that her solitude was not a lack but a presence. She moved through her days with a quality of attention that was so complete and so unhurried that it transformed even the smallest actions into something close to ceremony. She woke each morning before dawn, without an alarm, her body having learned over 60 years the rhythm of the light. She lay still for a few minutes, feeling the weight of the mat beneath her and the thin blanket over her, listening to the sounds outside, the first birds beginning, the water moving in the irrigation channel, the bamboo rustling in whatever breeze was stirring. Then she rose and walked to the clay stove and heated water for tea, and she sat at the low table by the window and drank the tea slowly, watching the mist lift from the paddies as the sun came up. It was in these mornings, in these long quiet hours before the village stirred, that Lien lived most fully. Not because anything happened, nothing happened. There was no drama, no revelation, no moment of sudden understanding. There was only the tea growing cooler in the cup, and the light growing stronger on the water, and the mist dissolving slowly, so slowly into the air, until the paddies emerged beneath it, like something being gently uncovered. She had begun to notice, in recent years, that the boundary between herself and the world around her had become very thin. Not in any mystical or frightening way, simply that, when she watched the mist dissolve, she felt something dissolve in herself as well. When the bamboo moved in the wind, she felt something move inside her that was not thought but was not quite feeling either, something more like a resonance, the way a bell continues to vibrate long after it has been struck. When the rain fell on the roof at night, she did not hear it as a sound separate from herself, but as something she was part of, the way a drop of water that has fallen back into the river is part of the river again, indistinguishable from the whole. She did not think about this. She did not try to understand it, or name it, or hold on to it. It simply happened, the way breathing happens without effort, without intention, without any sense that something remarkable was occurring. It was simply the way things were. On the morning this story asks you to stay with, Lien woke as she always did, before the light. The air was cool and still, carrying the smell of wet earth and the faint green sweetness that rises from rice paddies in the weeks before harvest, a smell that is part vegetable, part mineral, part something else entirely, something that has no name in any language, but that every person who has ever lived near a rice field knows without being told. She lay still and breathed it in, and the breathing was slow and deep and required nothing of her. She rose. She heated the water. She sat at the window with her tea. The mist was thick this morning, thicker than usual, a dense white that lay on the paddies like a cloth, so that only the tops of the bamboo groves were visible above it, their feathered crowns swaying gently in a wind she could not feel from where she sat. The light was coming in very slowly, a gradual brightening at the eastern edge of the sky, turning the mist from grey to pale gold. Lien watched this transformation with the same attention she might have given to a child learning to walk, patient, unhurried, entirely present to what was happening without any need to make it happen faster or slower. After the tea, she put on her shoes and walked out into the morning. The path from her house to the edge of the nearest paddy was short, perhaps 40 steps, over ground that was soft and damp beneath her feet. The grass on either side was heavy with dew, and as she walked, her shoes and the hem of her trousers grew wet. The air on her face was cool and carried moisture, and she breathed it in without comment, the way one breathes in air simply because the body knows how. The paddy stretched before her in a long, flat rectangle, bordered on 3 sides by low earthen banks, and on the 4th by a stand of bamboo so dense and tall that it formed a kind of green wall, rustling and whispering in the faintest movement of air. The rice was nearly ripe, the stalks bending slightly under the weight of the grain, the tops of the plants turning from green to a pale, dusty gold. The water in the paddy was very still, and the mist lay on its surface like something that had been poured there deliberately, and the reflection of the bamboo in the water was so perfect that it was difficult to tell, in the grey gold light, where the bamboo ended and the water began. Lien stood at the edge of the paddy for a long time. She did not think about standing. She did not think about anything. She simply stood, and the mist moved around her, and the light continued its slow brightening, and the rice swayed in its imperceptible motion, and the bamboo whispered, and the water was still, and all of these things were happening at once, and none of them required anything from her, no attention, no effort, no understanding, and yet she was aware of all of them, the way the sky is aware of everything beneath it without trying to be. Then she walked along the bank of the paddy, slowly, her feet finding the path without her needing to look down. The bank was narrow, just wide enough for one person, and on one side the paddy stretched out, golden and still, and on the other side, a small ditch carried water away from the field, its surface broken by tiny ripples where insects touched it. Dragonflies hovered above the ditch, their wings catching the light in brief flashes of blue and green. A frog sat on a stone at the water's edge, perfectly still, and Lien passed it without disturbing it, and the frog did not move. She walked the length of the paddy and then turned and walked back, and then she walked along the edge of the bamboo grove, where the ground was covered in a deep layer of fallen bamboo leaves, dry and papery and brown, making a soft sound beneath her feet with each step, like a whisper or a sigh. The bamboo above her was so tall and so thick that the sky was visible only in narrow strips between the crowns, and the light that reached the ground was green and shifting, moving with the movement of the bamboo in the breeze, so that the whole grove seemed to breathe slowly, rhythmically, like something alive and at rest. She sat down at the base of a bamboo, on the carpet of leaves, with her back against the smooth grey trunk. The wood was cool against her spine. Above her, the bamboo creaked and rustled, and the sound was not loud, but it filled the air completely, the way a single note of music can fill a room. She closed her eyes. With her eyes closed, the world did not disappear. It simply changed the way it arrived. The sounds became larger, the bamboo rustling, the water moving in the ditch, the birds calling from somewhere beyond the grove, the faint creak of her own breathing. The smell of the earth and the fallen leaves and the distant rice became richer, more layered, as though closing her eyes had opened something else. And beneath all of it, beneath sound and smell and the gentle pressure of the ground beneath her and the bamboo behind her, there was a stillness, not the stillness of silence, but a deeper stillness, the kind that exists beneath all movement, the way the bottom of a lake is still, even when the surface is stirred by wind. Leanne sat in this stillness for a very long time. The light changed around her, the green shifting as the sun moved higher, the shadows shortening. A breeze came and went. The bamboo swayed and settled and swayed again. And Leanne, sitting at the base of the tree, became without any effort, without any intention, less and less distinct from the world around her. Not disappearing, not dissolving in any dramatic sense, simply becoming transparent, the way glass becomes transparent when it is very clean, still there, still present, but no longer blocking the light from passing through. When she opened her eyes, the sun was higher and the mist had lifted entirely. The paddy gleamed in full daylight, a flat mirror of gold and green, the rice heavy and ripe, the water clear enough now to see the muddy bottom beneath. A heron stood at the far edge of the paddy, perfectly still, its grey body reflected in the water so precisely that it appeared to be two birds, one standing and one hanging, joined at the waterline in a single process, motionless shape. Leanne watched the heron for a while. Then she rose, brushed the bamboo leaves from her clothes, and walked back to her house. She made a meal rice from last year's harvest, cooked simply, with a few greens she had picked from the small garden behind the house. She ate slowly, tasting the rice, feeling its warmth spread through her body. After the meal, she washed the bowl and the pot in the small stream that ran behind the garden, and she dried them on a cloth and set them on the shelf. And she swept the floor of the house with a broom made of bamboo twigs, and the sweeping was slow and unhurried, and the sound of the broom on the wooden floor was soft and rhythmic, like breathing. In the afternoon, she sat again at the window, and the light was different now, coming from the west, turning the mist that was beginning to gather again on the paddies into shades of amber and rose. She did not drink tea this time. She simply sat, with her hands resting in her lap, and watched the light change, and felt the day settle around her like a garment being laid down at the end of a long wearing. And as the evening came on, and the light faded, and the first stars appeared above the bamboo, Leanne did not feel the day ending. She felt it continuing not into darkness but into a different kind of brightness, the brightness that exists when the eyes close and the inner world opens, quiet and vast and without edges. She did not move from the window. The darkness came on gently, the way sleep comes not all at once but in degrees, each one softer than the last. The sounds of the evening filled the air, the frogs beginning their chorus in the ditch, the bamboo settling into its night rhythm of creak and whisper, the distant sound of a dog barking once and then falling silent. And Leanne sat in all of this, and the boundary between her and the evening was so thin now that it was almost nothing at all, just the faintest suggestion of a self, resting in the world the way a leaf rests on still water, held without effort, moving without intention, belonging completely to everything around it. And now, as this final story settles around you, like the mist settles on the paddies softly, completely, without any sound, let it carry you somewhere very still. You do not need to remember anything from tonight. Not the fisherman's widow on the shore, not Dorje on the mountain, not Leanne in the bamboo grove. These stories have already done their work, not in your thinking mind, but somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath thought, beneath memory, beneath the tireless effort of holding yourself together. They have settled into you the way rain settles into the earth silently, invisibly, nourishing something that does not need to be seen to grow. Let your body sink. Let your hands go completely still. Feel the weight of you, the simple, precious weight of a body at rest, and let that weight be held. You do not need to hold yourself. You have never needed to hold yourself. Something has always been holding you, the same stillness that holds the rice paddy, the same quiet that holds the bamboo, the same peace that Leanne felt without needing to name it, simply by being present to a single ordinary day. You are already there. You have always been there. The peace you have been looking for tonight or any night is not at the end of these stories. It is not something you will find when you finally fall asleep. It is here. It is now. It is the stillness beneath your breath, the quiet beneath your thoughts, the space in which everything, every worry, every memory, every story about who you are arises and passes away like mist burning off at dawn. Let it all burn off. Let it all go. You do not need any of it tonight. Feel your breath slow. Feel the darkness behind your closed eyes, not empty but full of the same quiet that filled Leanne's mornings, the same peace that the bamboo holds, the same stillness that the water holds when nothing disturbs it. This is where you belong. This is where you have always belonged. And as this silence deepens, and the world grows very far away, and the last traces of waking dissolve like the final thread of mist lifting from a golden field, let yourself go. Let yourself sleep. You are enough. You have always been enough. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to become, nothing left to find. The night holds you. The silence holds you. The peace holds you. Sleep now. Sleep. Tonight you traveled far, across centuries and oceans, through the quiet lives of people who carried the same weight you carry, the weight of searching, the weight of believing that peace was somewhere ahead, somewhere just beyond the next step. You traveled through ancient Japan and the mountains of Tibet, through the shores of Sri Lanka and the bamboo groves of Vietnam, through the teachings of 6 traditions that, in their different languages, were saying the same thing. They were saying, it was always here, not at the end of the search, not after the suffering ends, not when you finally understand. It was here before you began looking. It was here in the washing of the rice, in the ordinary mind going about its ordinary day. It was here in the grief, beneath the grief, holding the grief without being broken by it. It was here in the mountain cave and in the bamboo grove and in the still water of the paddy at dawn. It was here in every moment you believed it was missing. It is here now. You do not need to carry tonight's stories with you into sleep. You do not need to remember the names or the teachings or the wisdom that was offered. Let all of it go. Let it dissolve the way the mist dissolved this evening over Leanne's field silently, completely, leaving only the quiet beneath. The understanding has already entered you in a way that does not require your mind to hold it. It will work in you while you sleep, the way seeds work in the dark without light, without effort, without anyone watching. These contemplative reflections are not a substitute for professional care, but they are offered with genuine warmth for your rest tonight. You may notice, in the days ahead, small moments of ease you did not expect. A breath that comes easily. A pause in which the searching does not resume. A fleeting sense that you have arrived somewhere you have always been. Trust those moments. They are not accidents. If this journey helped you tonight, a gentle like or share can help another exhausted, searching person find their way here. That is all that is asked. And now there is nothing left. No more stories. No more teachings. No more anywhere to go. Just this. Just the dark. Just the silence that has been waiting beneath everything. Patient as the earth. Quiet as the space between one breath and the next. You are enough. You have always been enough. Good night.